Morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Letha Ch'ien. I'm a professor of art history at Sonoma State University, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation with Dr. Amalia Mesa-Bains, an artist whose complex work betrays a rare curiosity, an expansive depth of knowledge, and an uncommon touch for beauty. The catalyst for today's event is, of course, the sparkling retrospective at the Berkeley Art Museum, Amalia Mesa-Bains, Archaeology of Memory. Feminist, Chicana, multimedia, historical and incessantly relevant to the present, the installations, prints, codices, and art books speak to the many facets of our lives and histories that cannot be separated or denied. The future NEA Fellow and MacArthur Genius Award winner was born in 1943 to undocumented Mexican parents in Santa Clara, California, where she took in the agricultural environment of pre-Silicon Valley South Bay. Prior to a master's degree in interdisciplinary education and a doctorate in clinical psychology, and prior to founding the Department of Visual and Public Art at CSU Monterey Bay, Mesa-Bains studied painting at San Jose State University in the 1960s, where she met emerging activists like Luis Valdez, the playwright, and was introduced to the Chicano movement. This sparked a lifetime of activism, criticism, research, and art practice that Mesa-Bains has intertwined throughout her long, glorious career. When I attended the press preview for the exhibit at the Berkeley Art Museum, I ran into a Chicano journalist who was maybe in his late 20s, and he could barely suppress his excitement. He was almost literally hopping up and down as he told me how much Mesa-Bains' art and activism had meant to him, how they had inspired him. It's a feeling many of us can't help but have in her presence. So please welcome me and jump up and down behind your computer screens in welcoming Dr. Amalia Mesa-Bains.
Thank you, Letha. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I know a bit about OLLI because at our CSU Monterey Bay, we had an OLLI and I've taught in it a few times. And I'm a great believer in lifelong learning. So one of the things I thought about how I would frame my talk today is really within the idea of my own lifelong learning, my own development, and the ways in which certain experiences in my family and my community and in the larger picture of the nation have influenced the way I make art and what I choose to make, and even to some degree, who I imagine my audience to be. So today I'm going to talk to you from a perspective of memory, of course, personal development, some of the interior issues of identity and group life, and most importantly, my own cultural history as a Chicana or Mexican descended person, born in the 1940s at the end of the war. So let's get started. I'm going to open up my first image. Okay, why is that? Oh, there it is. The first piece we're looking at, and I didn't start with Venus Envy. I decided to start with what I call the homenajes, or the pieces that have to do with people I created homages for through the tradition of the Days of the Dead. And the very first Dolores I did was in 1984 at the Mexican Museum, because I was lucky enough to meet her at the San Francisco Film Festival the year before she died. The festival honored her, and the Chicano Cine Acción group hosted a conference, and not a conference, but more like a gathering for her. So she had already been, because my own mother, Marina Gonzalez, a very important figure. You know, for Mexican people living in the US in the 50s, my parents came very young. I was born in the 40s. But even in the 50s, the society was quite segregated. So my mother and father, when they were young, got to see people like Dolores Del Rio at the movies, at the prize fights. They were the legends, the icons. They were the stars of their generation. And my mother used to talk to me about her while we watched the Late Late Show, which was my version of TV, and I'm in the generation that TV was first inaugurated. So of course, I barely slept because I wanted to watch it all the time. It was such a miracle. So I saw Flying Down to Rio, Madame Dewberry, Flame of Tahiti. But then on the Saturdays, I went to the Mexican Cine with my cousins, and they introduced me to her as Maria Candelaria, a woman of indigenous background, La Abandonada, a single mother. So she played in a dual world, and for me, she was a kind of binational bridge. And I used the first transformation of the altar into a vanity that became a bit of a signature for me over the years. Oh, I forgot to say that the woman next to Dolores in the picture is my mother. When the Smithsonian acquired the Dolores piece in 1995, even though it originally didn't have this small picture of my mother next to Dolores, they allowed me to do that. My mother was still alive then, but I wanted to honor her. And now that she's passed, it means a great deal to me that she and Dolores are side by side on the altar. This next piece was also an homenaje, and it was to the Virgen de Guadalupe. I was asked to do this for a show that was traveling in Latin America around the time of the quincentennial, which I understand from many people was sort of a very important historical time of recognizing the Spanish, I want to say intervention, but some say the discovery of the New World. Of course, the New World is alive and well and didn't need to be discovered. But Queen of the Waters was my first attempt to create an image of her in this very complex way for a new audience in Latin America whose work I had never done work there. So this first one was done for Ante America, or Before America, the traveling show from Colombia. And it's based on, to some degree, a conversation at a conference I went to on Latin American religiosity at Princeton. And one of the speakers was Miguel Leon Portillo, a very, very famous Mesoamericans all over the world. And he wrote a book called Broken Spears. So he contradicted the prevailing story of Guadalupe being seen on a mountaintop and by a native person and telling him to go to the bishops of the church to build her a chapel. But Miguel Leon Portillo's version of it was, she said to the boy, I am the queen of the waters. I am the mother of the land of the dead being Mictlan. So when I took it up, I put in several images of indigenous figures like Coatlicue, the Tonantzins, the earth mothers that preceded the Guadalupe figure that the Spanish brought in. And so it was a story about water, tears, rain, and the history of all of these indigenous goddesses that had come before. So it was a telling in multiple times, hence the clocks. Now we start with the Venus Envy series. And I have to say, part of a retrospective is that it forces you into the process of retrospection, looking back at your life and coming to conclusions that were not available to you when you were younger. And so what I've discovered in many ways is that I started Venus Envy in 1995, which would have made me 52 at the time. And my earlier work, as you can see, was more collective. It was more expansive around themes that were particular to the Chicano movement. But I had never done work that was ultimately personal. And so I became very ill around the early 90s with a lung heart disease, and they thought I would have to have transplants. And my time was limited according to the medical. Of course, I didn't believe them for a minute because I had so many other things to do. But that's a turning point. And I say this to all of you, some of whom may be older like me. I'll be 80 this year. Our lives are marked by those transformative moments, sometimes when our bodies give way, or sometimes when we experience grief or loss. And in those junctures, we make decisions about how we will go forward. And so when I got so sick and I started to get better, and many young people said to me, but you should make work that's more permanent, because up until that, all of those were ephemeral. Some of them been able to be reconstructed like Dolores and Queen, but many others, the Frida Kahlo, the Santa Teresa, Ofrenda, none of those exist anymore. They couldn't be recreated because I made them in a sort of ephemeral and fugitive manner. So Venus Envy was my developmental story of my life. The first stage, of course, is I'm young, and this is my first Holy Communion. And so I created it with 3 characters in mind: the nun, the bride, and the virgin. And that row of images on the wall below the mirrors are little small postcard transfers of them. Also, it was a coming of age for me. All the women in my family helped me to get dressed. One of my jokes has always been that it was my greatest fashion moment. It's been downhill ever since, because I had the greatest outfit. And so we see in here the row of mirrors from the Hall of Mirrors. The white boxes or vitrines are the Museum of Self. And in the corner, we see the Boudoir Chapel. And I use lots of images in the mirrors of various mystical figures, because for me, the liturgical drama, the mysticism of the church was very compelling when I was young. As I got older, I found the church more difficult for me to engage in because of the politics of the church and the treatment of women. But this is a close-up of Bernini's depiction of Santa Teresa, and I think it might be reversed. Oh, it's probably because of the mirror. And as she's receiving these golden spears, and she experiences the embodiment of Christ in her own physical being. Many of these mystical writings were actually extremely erotic, and not unlike other poetry and writing of that era. But I find it still compelling as a story of divine love, and how these women, many of the nuns that I have followed, Santa Teresa, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, also battled the church for their rights and for their status. Another part of this piece, which I had to do when it was first shown in New York in 1993, was the Guadalupe wall. And the Guadalupe wall, or the Virgen de Guadalupe images, were actually what I used to call Chicano 101. I was showing in New York in the early 90s. Very little was known about Chicano art. So I thought, well, I should give them some setting. And so for the Virgin. So I used images from Carmelo Mascarza, Patsy Valdez, John Valadez, Cesar Martinez, and of course, the late and always iconic Yolanda Margaret Lopez. So these were above the actual candles where you would bless yourself in the church. And this is a detail of the Boudoir Chapel. In some respects, it references the wedding I never had. I was married, but I didn't have a wedding. No bouquet, no big satin dress. So I conveyed all of my longing into this piece. And also because I wanted to honor Coatlicue, the mother goddess. We saw her previously in the Queen of the Waters series. But Coatlicue was a triple goddess, really of birth, life, death. And she was a figure of motherhood. So in some respects, my mother's photograph in the small pictures on the vanity are really a part of that. And I even have a picture of my grandmother, Amalia. Completing the first chapter, which was in 93, I spent a few more years thinking about what I might do. And in the in-between time, I was lucky enough to go to, several churches and meet with many nuns. And I began to get interested in the life of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. So in my second chapter of Venus Envy, which is called The Harem and Other Enclosures, I based it on the convent and the harem as being sites of containment, where women live their lives in the company of other women and are cut off from, in many ways, the rest of the world. And this stage of my life was my early marriage, and I have had a lovely marriage. We're at 57 years now. But I have to say that the first few years, I experienced what my mother often said to me. You get busy in home with your family, and you lose track of your friends. And so I went back into the experience of other artists to try to regain that sense of belonging. So this is the image of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, very much a child genius, a very, very brilliant woman in many, many fields, including poetry, musicology, science, but she was at odds with the church for many years. This is my interpretation of her library. Now, what happened to Sor Juana, she went to the church very young, like at 12 or 13. She died at 32 because she crossed swords with one of the bishops when he asked her to talk to him, to write him a letter about her interpretation of the mercy of God. She wrote the letter innocently, assuming he only wanted to know what she thought. But he, in fact, shared the letter and then chastised her publicly for writing, because nuns were not to be seen as intellectuals. So in that respect, Sor Juana was, in a sense, tricked into her own demise. And so this library is my fantasy of the library that she once had and the library that she was forced to give up. And in her library, 5,000 books. She had a laboratory for chemistry and biology, and she wrote her poetry there. And she actually ran it much like a salon. So people came from all over the world to meet her and talk with her because she was so, well, so radical and so brilliant. She's sometimes referred to as La Décima Musa, or the 10th muse. Close-up of it, which has the triptych mirror behind her, has actually, well, it has a crack in it, because as I was finishing the piece to send it off museum, it slipped off the table while I was gold leafing the edges, and it flew up into the air, much like a bird because of the wings, and slammed to the ground, and the mirror cracked. And I stood there just totally terrified about what was I going to do. But I realized the crack was above her head, coming eminently out of her mind. And then I realized that is often in the work of installation, there are unconscious moments and accidents that are part of the. So I had to glue everything back in and consequently cut my fingers a bit. So there were some little spots of blood, which I also really liked, is this kind of suffering in the Catholic imagination. And so you'll see on the table references to her biology or chemistry, her poetry. And there is a book there that I created for her. And also there's a poem that was written for me when I won my MacArthur, and the poet wrote it for me, and it was comparing my work to the work of Sor Juana, which I was very, very deeply honored. And there's also a picture of my grandmother, Amalia. And so it's created like a salon. There is a quote on the wall from her, because in responding to the painting, which was painted at a time when she was still alive, most paintings were done after her death. She responded to the painter and basically said, these lying pigments facing you with every charm brush can supply, set up false premises of color to lead astray the unwary eye. Here, against the ghastly tolls of time, bland flattery has staked a claim, defying the powers of passing years to wipe out the memory and the name. And here, in this hollow artifice, frail blossoms hanging on the wind, vain pleading in a foolish cause, poor shield against what fate has wrought. All others fail in the end. A body goes to dust, to shade, to naught. And for me, that is one of the more powerful pieces that she wrote. She wrote something called a respuesta, which is considered the first manifesto, feminist manifesto of the New World. But I truly love this because I think it's like the Vanitas tradition of the Baroque in Spain, but it's also what some of us realize as we age. It's all not in the end, only if you remember. And that's one of the traditions of the Days of the Dead. This is a picture of my home altar. And the large painting is by Patsy Gonzalez of Montserrat, one of the Black virgins. We went on a tour with a French show with our work in the 90s, and we got to Barcelona. And so, of course, we took a trip to the shrine of Montserrat. But I'm showing you this because there's many virgins there. And some of my favorites are Caridad del Cobre, of course, Guadalupe, Remedios, the Virgen de San Juan de los Lagos. And what I noticed is they all have fabulous outfits. And I used to say, is there a closet somewhere where all of these women's clothes, their scepters, their crowns, their babies, where is it all? And then in the midst of all of that, I was preparing for a show, and I'd been thinking about the Virgin's Closet for a while. And in the midst of it, I got a call from my friend Victor Zamudio Taylor, who has now passed. I have to say, I live in a community of debt. There are so many people I've loved and cared for, and people who have helped me to do my work, and many, many of them have passed now. So I honor them whenever I can and talk about them and name them so they will not be forgotten. Victor Zamudio, scholar, I met him at Princeton. He was brilliant in 4 languages. He was a student of both the Mesoamerican and the contemporary Chicano. And he told me that he had seen an image of the Virgin resting in a garden. And I thought, really? I thought she never took the day off. So then he told me it was the enclosed garden, but I thought he said the closed garden, and I felt completely vindicated. And so off I went, getting my poor mother to make capes for me, and I began collecting crowns. And then came the picture he had been talking about, and it was this picture. It's a painting. I used to call it the Master of Frankfurt Garden, but I think it's called the Master of Rhineland now. It's been renamed. But it is an hortos conclusos, or an enclosed garden. And you see that it's walled, that she's resting in repose. She's reading. Someone else is amusing baby Jesus. They're picking apples. There's a little dragon sleeping in the corner. And so once I realized that I'd made the mistake, it was, as we say, too late to turn back. So I went ahead with it. And it has been one of my more unusual pieces. But this, along with the library and the harem, were the 3 sites of the 2nd chapter of Venus and the harem and other enclosures. And the garden of the Virgin was the spirit, the library of Sor Juana was the mind, and the harem was the body. And this is a very tricky image because the backdrop is actually a photograph of the harem that I did at Williams when I did the 2nd chapter. But it is a blow up on the wall, and I have attached in front of it the mirrors that were there. And the mirrors have like these images that I attached from the back after I've scraped off part of the mirror. I call it the cheap mirror trick, but it's very magical. And some people think that, you know, they're holograms or projections, but it's really just this little mirror trick. And I picked all these Orientalist paintings of the harem. And when I got to Williams, discovered that the Clark, which is the sister museum, has the greatest holdings of Oriental paintings in the US, and they all thought I did it on purpose. So I've learned now, when I've made some kind of strange coincidence or an error, to say, oh yes, I did that on purpose, but really I didn't. It was just, I needed it as a backdrop. And so this all happened because I went to the 3rd biennial at Istanbul in Turkey. And during that time, I actually visited the Sultan's harem at Topkapi and became entranced with how 350 women could have all lived in one space. And like all the other places of containment, the convent and the library and the church and education, women often find each other and comfort and support while they go through difficult times. So many times women's lives are controlled in these spaces. And I was fascinated how they managed to find a way to have companionship. So among the 350 women in any given time in the harem, who were all from foreign countries, not Turkish, there were writers and poets and musicians and singers and librarians. They all had different roles. And only about 20 of them ever actually, well, should we say, were intimate with a sultan. So they did go out of the harem from time to time on carriage rides. And these are the messages they sent. And also they give gifts of handkerchiefs and the colors of the handkerchiefs. And these veils were an embodiment of their sentiments toward those who loved them. So we have a blue, a purple, a pink, an orange, and a white. So red, which I don't have on this picture, I think it's on the side. Red was passionate love, orange was heartache, green was intention, pink was a love bond, purple was that they were suffering from love, blue was hopelessness, black was hopelessness, and blue meant they were hoping for a reunion. And a handkerchief that was given that was torn and burned signified, I am dying of heartache, fading and wilting. So these women found ways to communicate with the people who waited often for long periods of time to see them come out when they were allowed to go on a picnic. And now, this is, we laughingly call her the big girl at my house, but that's primarily because when I decided to do the third chapter of Venus Envy, which is a little further along in my life developmentally, I had struggled my whole life when I was very young from being big. I mean, I was tall. For a Mexican of my generation, I was like 5'6". Now I've shrunk, so we all know how that happens. But in the case of the big girl, or myself as the big girl, I found in a way a kind of vocabulary that was given to me by people telling me that I was out of control, unruly, I talked too much, I did not fit in, I was resistant to the rules. And I struggled with that along with the size of my own body because I gained weight as I got older and from time to time went on extreme diets. But generally speaking, I learned to live with the fact that this is what I am and this is who I am. So when I did this piece, I picked a setting in the Mesoamerican world because most of my Venus envies have a sort of metaphor of a place, some place that I imagined I would have been had life been different, or that stands in as an area of curiosity that I have. And many of the Chicanas in my generation were deeply involved in study of the Mesoamerican world, looking for a sense of origin so they wouldn't always feel so displaced, so much an outsider. So I picked Cihuatlampa, which I call the place of the giant women. It was the area in the afterlife that women who died in childbirth were allowed to be honored, and their job was to help the setting of the sun every day. I gave her a wardrobe. I thought she needed a cape. And I was also once again trying to align with the natural world. So she's like a mountain. The feathered cape is like the fauna of that world. And the copper dress with the branches alludes to the forest. Unfortunately, I don't have an image today of the back of the mirror, which is covered with shells and is really about the idea that she lived in this afterlife of paradise where all was possible. And this is a rendering, a Mesoamerican piece of the Cihuateotl, which was the woman who died in childbirth and carried the sun to its setting. It's the Mesoamerican version of My Big Girl. And she, in some respects, embodies the idea that the only way that women could be valuable was to sacrifice themselves. Okay, we're going into transparent migrations, which is really another piece anchored in the Mesoamerican world, which is why I put it in here. It's not part of Venus Envy, but this is a beautiful, beautiful rendering of the idea of Tenochtitlan, the city in the lake that the Spanish saw when they first came. And it was an extraordinary place. It was a place that was in many ways comparable to the great cities of the old world. It was really as large as Athens, had populations that really rivaled the old world. And it was all on water, and it was the space that had been found by the Mexica in their search for the old places. So this was part of a show called The Road to Aslan at LACMA in 2001. And my late friend Victor Zamudio and my late friend Virginia Fields organized the show. I was on the advisory group until they decided to put a Chicano section in. So it was largely an archaeological show. And so Chicanos who had believed in Aslan and been ridiculed for it were vindicated, because it turned out that Aslan was the northern part of Mexico, the southwestern part of the United States, and that in the northern part of Mexico, it had been the place that the Mexicas had found that was their origin place. So Tenochtitlan was, of course, led by Moctezuma II. It was a city that had prospered and was estimated to have a population of 200 to 300,000 residents. The conquistadors described Tenochtitlan as the greatest city they had ever seen. So I recreated it in the bottom of this armoire. The dress that hangs there is a play on Frida's. My dress hangs here. It has my wedding mantilla. And I originally thought I would have 30 cactus until I worked with a glass blower hand blown 2, and then I realized I could not afford any more. So it's got glass representing the lake, and the maguey represent the floating islands or chinamplas where people grew their food. And Tenochtitlan itself is depicted through an arrangement of miniature, crystal and glass. And I arranged it by ordering all of these pieces. And I read a lot on Tenochtitlan. I found out more about it. It was situated on a human-made island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. From its central location, Tenochtitlan served as a hub for Aztec trade and politics. It features gardens, palaces, temples, and raised roads with bridges that connected to the mainland. When the first objects that were sent from the New World into Europe, there were many people there as they were being unpacked in of all places, Brussels. And one of them was, of course, Dürer, the engraver and artist. And he was really, really shocked, because what he saw, he said, these things were so precious, they're valued at 100,000 florins or guilders. They're wonderful objects of human use, better worth than prodigies. They were made of gold and silver. They were snakes with orbs in their mouth, large sun-shaped pieces. And he said, after the days of my life, I have seen nothing that rejoiced my heart so much as these things. For I saw amongst them wonderful works of art, and I marveled at the subtle genius of men in foreign lands. Indeed, I cannot express all that I thought there. So it tells us that Tenochtitlan was a major world city, and that the life that was lived there was an extraordinary life. And unfortunately, it was cut short. The Noche Triste is when the Spanish used the causeways to enter the city. And I've always joked and said, when they had the banquets for the Spanish, they really shouldn't have shown all that gold. You know, in the Aztec world, gold was not valuable. Turquoise was valuable. Quetzal feathers and other feathers were valuable. So they hid all of that. But in their sense of hospitality, they served these Spanish conquistadors all the extraordinary foods of the New World, which became later the foods of the Old World, on golden platters and golden pitchers to eat on golden plates. And, you know, my joke is sometimes when guests come, you should hide the silver, because that's what set off the war and the conquest. The second piece related to Cihuatlampa and the kind of what I call the geography of memory is a piece dedicated to my family. I mentioned earlier when we were talking with Letha that I followed my family memories, not just through ancestry.com, but because my great-great-grandfather, Mariano Escobedo, for whom my grandmother was named, was a general of the North in Mexico during the French intervention. And he took the sword from Maximilian at the Hill of the Bells. So what I discovered was that my name, Maxine, which is my first name, Amalia is my middle name, and my cousin Carlotta, so we were Max and Carlotta most of our childhood, was actually a family joke that no one bothered to tell us, because Maximilian and Carlotta were sent by Napoleon into the New World to collect on his debt and to see what he could do with the amount of gold that had already been processed there. So Private Landscapes and Public Territories is part of a series that I did for the sesquicentennial, or the 150th anniversary of California and the Southwest when it was taken from Mexico after the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. An astronomical get for the United States. Well, that means every Southwestern state you can think of and some others, which of course led to things like the gold rush, lumber, silver. It was an extraordinary acquisition, one would say. And for many of us, it is the date that we use as the beginning of a Chicano world, 1848. And I've used many, many pieces in respect to that. But this one is particular for me because it's about my family. This is a close-up of a much larger garden with garden walls. And what I've done is I've used aspects of my family history inside the cabinet, or the cities that my parents left, my parents' family left from, and the cities they arrived in the US, Mexico to US. And there is a little altar in the bottom. And in the front of it is a play on a French parterre garden. And there is a close-up of Max and Carlotta. And the man in the pale little image in front of the silver apple, that is Mariano Escobedo, my great-grandfather. So I've played with the idea of land as a sort of social geography, a way of understanding. Wherever we arrive, no place is empty when we get there. There are ghosts of those who came before. So to that sense, this is my own spiritual geography, my own family memory and history. And I use it sometimes to remind myself of my lineage and that our battle on the border is not done, and that the border will remain for us a wound, a slice of the soul, a way of seeing the disruption and rupture of a land and a people. This is the river piece. And I did this piece for a show about the border in Los Angeles. Michael Deere and Gustavo Lefebvre decided to do this piece about a sort of a post-colonial metropolis, like Mexico on both sides of the border. So I created a piece. I made a maquette, and another person helped me fabricate this particular piece. And then I worked with two different glass blowers to blow the glass. Sorry, I'm turning off my phone. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the rocks, because the rocks are very important to me. And I started this piece even before the Trump era. I've been doing border pieces probably from, I think 90 on to, it's about 34 years or 33 years now. And it's only gotten worse. And it's one of the things that I find so terribly tragic. And we're warming up again. I saw, and it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or a Democratic president. In the end, we have not resolved our immigration policy or our immigration situation. So everybody ends up sending troops there, or building bigger walls, or trying to put babies in cages, or losing count of the babies, or just generally wreaking havoc on people who are very poor, who are leaving countries all over Central and Latin America because they have no choice anymore. They're trying to save their families. So I asked friends of mine to give me their families' names who crossed the river first, the first crossing into the US, and then it got to be people in Puerto Rico, and then it got to be people in Latin America, and then people started sending me their families that left before the Holocaust. So I have many, many names in here, and I'll share only a few. These are my family names: Mariana Escobedo Mesa, Lorenzo y Mesa, Luis y Mesa, Rosendo Escobedo, Jose Escobedo, Jesus Escobedo, Amalia Gonzalez Cornejo, Marina Gonzalez, Julie Ridholm Waldholm's aunt, Julie Amelia Rodriguez, Dolores Alvarez, Ray Tejes's mother, Antonia Loya Tejes, Teresita Fernandez, family, Maria Teresa Variana, Alfonso Nelson Fernandez, Dolores Teresa Martin, Consuelo Alfonso Belanchi, Viva and Sandro gave us the names of the Bosque and Paredes families, and Hernandez Saldana, and my dear friend Tere Romo gave me the names of Gil Gonzalez de la Torre, who was her, I believe, grandfather, who was a bracero and was brought in during the bracero moments. So we find that the river is in many ways a map of loss and longing and separation, and sometimes even grief for those who die on the journey. And now I'm going to end with the last chapter of Venus Envy, which had its title from an accident I had when we returned from a trip to Paris. So it's called The Road to Paris and its Aftermath. And the piece we're looking at, that's part of this section, are two large prints. That's my father, Lorenzo, with a snake under him, the bronchial tubes, and the pine groves. And next to it is an image of the crushed car when we had our accident in 2001, a rollover in which I broke my neck, my arm, my leg, and my elbow. I had multiple surgeries, elbow replacement. It was a marker, another one of those life turns. And I began to think about what it meant for me in terms of how we heal, how we change over time. And when I had to recover, and it took quite a long time, I slept in a hospital bed at home once I got out of the recovery center for about 4 years. I went through 5 years of physical therapy. And in that time, I could not make any art because my arm was so damaged. And eventually my elbow was replaced and my wrist was reconstructed. But I did find something in it, as we all do when life deals us such a blow. I found my family's history in healing. I'd always known it about my father. He healed from everything, but I didn't realize that when he was a child, my grandmother had soaked pine branches in water and made him drink it every 10 days so that he could heal his bronchioles, and that she put snake powder in his food to help him with his skin condition so he could regenerate. And then he told me stories much older about his grandmother's brothers and curanderas that were brought in and rolled eggs over them. Eggs are a way of diagnosing the trauma of the body. And then you crack the eggs and put it in a bowl under the bed, and then they come and they read the eggs. There are many, many techniques, and some of them are on the bottom shelf. So I recreated my own idea of healing with my grandmother, Mariana Escobedo, in the light box. The two shells represent on the top the Western medicine, and on the bottom the curandera or healer. The 3 glass jars refer to my father's efforts with the pine boughs. And the large cabinet is the cabinet of healing that has a shelf for every member of my family. And on the table, there is a book called the Healing Book. Curanderismo is a worldview that does not separate the living from the dead, or the body from the mind, or the spirit from the natural world. And so in many respects, Mexicanos who are manifesting any illness or healing will often be treated with one of the diagnoses of healing. And in many ways, it's a kind of balancing between the terrestrial and the celestial. And an understanding of the somatic arises because we understand that the emotional psychic state of the individual expresses where the illness is in the body. Such bodily often seen to be a result of the social situation of the individual and include references in many respects to the collective of their family. So the next one you're going to see is you're going to see the lower part, which has the characteristic cures, and I have images of healers like Don Jarillo Jaramillo, and I have images that, or objects that refer to Caribbean healing, because I was influenced much by my friendship with the late Juan Bosa and my comadre Marta Moreno Vega, who developed the Caribbean Cultural Center, many other organizations, and now runs the Afro Corrido in San Juan, Puerto Rico. So I use some of the objects from the curanderas, I guess I would say it, repertoire. So the healing would involve sage, when you burn it and blow it over the body. There's the snake skin for my father. There's the eggs that roll over the body, and there are certain herbs and roots that are used. So the curanderas botanica is both a family memory and an honoring of the traditions of healing that come out of Latin America and Mexico. And on the far end, you see the figures that are, I think of them as sort of transnational, or in some ways, they embody two worlds, the Spanish Catholic world and the world of the indigenous and the African. So in the founding or the discovery of the new, the Spanish brought with them African slaves, and the African slaves brought with them, of course, their own way of practicing their religion and their healing. And we talk about worshiping under the Virgin, which is a term that in many Afro-Cuban and Afro-Caribbean homes, they would have a table with all the Catholic saints and a curtain of little fabric below it. And if you lifted the fabric, you would find the last of the African gods below. So in many ways, my life has been complicated, very much a hybridity of American life and of Mexican life. And because I've been married for 58 years to my husband, Richard Bains, who's African-American, and because I'm third generation of mixed marriages, I have had a close association with the tercer raíz, or the third root of Mexico's culture, which is African, and came with the enslavement of so many people. So I hope in some way that these stories, as complex and wordy as they are, have helped you to understand that for me as an artist, I've tried to tell a story about people who are not so easily known in the United States, about a way of life that still maintains its richness, its family stories, family foods, family music, but that is also transformed by living in the United States. And I am a Chicana born in the United States. And I still hold to that past, but I innovate on it and I create new forms with it. And most of all, I share it in hopes that we will all come to a better understanding of our own diversity in this country. And it has not been work done alone. I've done it with friends, with scholars, with other artists, with community groups and community organizations, which have been the incubators of our movement. And so I'm grateful to have had this time with you, and I'm turning it back to Letha in case there are any questions.
Thank you. You can't hear all of the applause that I know is happening in all of our respective homes. Every time you speak, I learn so much, and I have so many thoughts that go in new directions. And what you were just saying about the stories that people who are not so easily known in the United States seems extraordinarily important. And before I ask my question, I invite everyone to please submit your questions if you'd like to raise your hand, or if you'd like to type your question into the chat. We can have a lively discussion with Dr. Mesa-Bains. So I'm just going to go first while people are gathering their thoughts. You co-wrote a book with Bell Hooks, the famed theorist and thinker, intellectual, activist. And at one point, there was a quote I wrote down while I was reading it. Art is an inherently a social practice. It's a social act, and it's embedded in one's relationship to the larger world, which is what I think you were just speaking of. And I thought this is so counter to the Western American white history of art that spotlights solitary genius male artists working alone, a la Jackson Pollock. And what kind of understanding do you think we gain of the world if we view art as a social practice instead of a solitary one?
Well, I think, first of all, even our understandings, not just of contemporary, but master art, are a bit flawed, and they've been whitewashed, pardon the pun. And the stories of the struggles they engaged in, of labor movements at the time, of rural life, of feudal life, of what they were trying to say, has been removed from us. And so we only see them for the painting that they are, and not for the context that they reveal. So I think what we're doing now is really reversing it, like foreground, background. And we're saying that the work we do, which is a work of art, is still beholden to some sort of thoughtful critique and question of the world we live in. We don't live alone in an isolation, and we observe around us every day. I barely can turn on the morning news because it is so deeply troubling. And we all experience this fissure in our country now, this division, the intensity of the violence, the crisis of climate change, the unequal aspects of life, which became very obvious in the COVID pandemic, when the people that were dying in the largest numbers were people of color because they had to serve. They didn't get to stay home. They had to go out because that's the jobs they do. And I was working on Day of the Dead during COVID, and I discovered, looking for statistics, and the last ones that have been out show nearly a third of the COVID deaths were Latinos. And it is not surprising because of the work that they do. They work in hospitals, they work in cleaning facilities, they work in food, they work everywhere. And so I think, knowing all those things, how can we make art without acknowledging it? How we acknowledge it varies from artist to artist. I use family memories. I use ancient tropes. I play around with all kinds of materiality, but I'm still after the same questions. Like, why is this happening? What can we do to have better lives? And in that respect, Belle and I came together in actually a first panel right after the movie Show the Right Thing. And they did a panel at NYU called Show the Right Thing, but from the point of view of artists and writers. And she and I both discovered we came there to tell a story about our grandmothers. And she went first, and then I looked at her and I didn't want to poke her and say, what? That's my story. And so then I did mine, and she said later, well, I guess we have the same story. And I said, yes, I think we have a very similar life. And then after that, she began to ask me to join her for dialogue conversations in different places that she went to. It wasn't known then that she was ill, but she was ill for a very, very long time. And sometimes she was just tired and she'd say, Amalia, come in and we'll get you a chair and we'll just sit there and we'll just talk like we talk. And then one day we said, why are we doing all this talking? We're not recording it. So then that's how the book came about. And she came to my school at CSU Monterey Bay. But I am grateful to her every day for the insights that she shared with me and how many, many things we found were so similar for us. And I regret that she's gone, but I'm glad she's at peace. And I think of her quite often. I talk to her very frequently, especially when I'm struggling with ideas, because she was a wonderful person to run your ideas by.
We gain so much through social practice, through connecting with others.
Yes.
Yeah.
It also assuages what is now being a theme in health, which is loneliness. There's so much written now about isolation, not just for young people and teenagers, but the elderly too. The isolation and loneliness. And I think social engagement is also one of the things that keeps us from deteriorating. So I say whatever form you use, if it's gardening, if it's cooking, make it a social practice, engage with others, find the history of your flowers, find out the history of botany in your family. There's always stories everywhere.
On that note, I invite you to socially engage. You can raise your hand either by looking at the reaction button on the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, there's a raise hand function, or you can type your question into the chat. And we welcome, as you just heard, all forms of engagement. I don't know about everyone else here, but I've been to the show 3 times now, which isn't nearly enough. And each time I go, I see new things and new elements, new aspects of the work. We have a comment in the chat from Stephen Rice. Thank you for your work and for a wonderful, inspiring presentation.
Thank you for being a listener. I know it was a long one.
And speaking with Amalia before we began, I was saying I was looking at transparent migrations. That's with the glass mirrored armoire and the glass shards in front with the Maggie cactus, and trying to lean forward to see into the armoire as far as I could, but fearing that I was going to fall. And that sense of being able to access memory in the past, but also being unable to touch it, to be as close to it as I wanted, to really know every aspect of it, pervades, I think, that what you were saying with the border being a wound.
Mm-hmm.
It's
and
not
I use the floor materials often to keep people from getting too close.
clever.
So they're clever, huh? So like the lavender and the potpourri and the broken glass, because museums get very nervous when you put out lots of little things and there's no like stanchion or, cord across, and I can't bear that. So I just invented this so they'd stop bothering me about it, because I wouldn't mind if people got close. I think it's better because they can see better.
I tried to go as far as I could. I was leaning very precariously and making one of the guards pretty nervous.
Oh, yeah.
Questions? Have people had a chance to go see the show? We're lucky it's up until September.
Really? They changed the date, huh? Wow.
I think so. I think we have a nice long time to see it. August 13th, excuse me, sorry, August 13th.
Okay, that's good. That's almost a month more. I was going to say September is cutting it close because it has to go to Phoenix next.
Oh, great. Which museum?
It's going to the Phoenix Art Museum, and it opens November 2nd.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And then next year it goes to New York in the spring at Museo del Barrio.
Oh, fabulous.
And from there it goes in the fall of 24 to the San Antonio Museum of Art. And then in the spring of 25, it comes back to California to the Cheech.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
When
I
we
can live through it all. I'm turning 80 this summer, so I'm thinking, God, can I last that? Yes, I can, and I'm going to.
happy birthday in anticipation, we have a comment in the chat. Wonderful ancestors say it all.
Yes. You know, I think often there aren't questions. There are really more affirmations or recognitions that individuals have when they see the work or when I talk about it. And sometimes it isn't meant to be shared. It's a recognition of their own, something that they come to when thinking about it. And, you know, I said at the beginning, because of lifelong learning, and, you know, my PhD's in psychology, and one of the areas that I was very interested in was adult development, the idea of the dream, that when we're in our early 20s, early adulthood, we fashion a dream of what our life will be. And when you're my age, even earlier, 60s, 70s, you begin to look back over that dream to see whether or not you realized it. Sometimes we surpass it, sometimes we don't reach it, but that evaluative process is part of the lifelong learning. And I was lucky enough to know the Oshers, and I really have to say that I think they've done a great service to people to give them access to learning that continues into adulthood. Because one of the things that they discovered after the early stages of development, like of Erik Erikson and others, they discovered later that development doesn't stop at adulthood. It goes on into early adulthood, late adulthood, and even very, very old age. We never stop growing and learning, and we never stop changing. And I tried to point out in my talk those places along the line of my life in which I had to make changes. And doing the retrospective was the first time that I realized the works in the show begin in the 90s and go to contemporary time, that from 89 on until present time, I was ill. I had a heart-lung disease, then I had a catastrophic accident, and then I had another heart disease. And so through all these years of making things, in many respects, art has been my method of healing, my tool of choice. And I hope for other people watching this who may be going through similar things, that looking at art, learning about art, and being with art will help them in their lives in this process of lifelong learning. I think we should call it a day.
Yes,
And
on that note, on your words of wisdom, thank you.
and I'm very grateful for everybody's attention, and I hope you get to see the show.
Yes,
And thank
go.
you, and thank the whole staff at OLLI for making this possible.
And thank you everyone for spending your Friday morning with us.